I am a kayaker as well as a sailor, as well as an author. I've been kind of living on the Salish Sea most of my adult life. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to read a few sections from my book so that you get a taste of it. I was going to read four, but with time the way it is, I may only read three. Here's a couple of great pictures to just kind of get you started. And so I'm going to read from the introduction first, and I'll just leave these here while I read from the introduction. I'm at home on the islands in the Salish Sea. I came here as a young teenager. It took some time to identify the natural wonders that grabbed my heart. As I lived, fished, and sailed around the islands, I marveled at their incredible beauty and learned about the life-giving seeds and berries of the arbutus, fir, hemlock, yew, garry oak, and cedars. Salal, Oregon grape, and huckleberry soon became part of my diet, along with the cod and salmon, crab, clams, and oysters. I heard the herons, gulls, sea ducks, juncos, and warblers call. As the years passed, I began to see loss and fragmentation. In the 80s and early 90s, fights were strong over clear-cut logging, slash burning, and development. Mega corporations like Macmillan Bloedel, Westwood, Westply, and other numbered companies were ravaging the forests and trashing streams, once the home of wild creatures living on these precious islands. People were moving to the islands in droves. The forests, wildlife, and rural refuges were fast disappearing. There were a few provincial parks at Montague Harbor and Mount Maxwell, but the majority of the land was being sold and developed. Most newcomers did not realize that their land clearing resulted in degradation and loss of sensitive ecosystems found nowhere else in the world. The land and its wildlife had no voice to object. I started to feel solastalgia, a form of emotional or existential grief caused by environmental change, linked to mooring what is lost. So here's a list of the islands that are covered in the book with the themes that kind of go with those islands. So when I was living on Salt Spring Island in the 90s, I joined others who were promoting positive alternatives, green building, community recycling, and composting projects. Learning how to change our human practices to integrate with the cycles of life means we have to cross that boundary of separation we erect between ourselves and the natural world. We're more than kin with nature. We are part of her. To feel and experience this kinship with the natural world, we need to open to it, enter into its realm, learn its rhythms of tide, fresh and salt water, the connections between the tree and mycelium, and the birds that eat the berries. One of my many mentors, Michael Dutton from Main Island, encouraged me to notice the edges between ecosystems and different habitats and all of the living earth around. Then, like a bad dream, suddenly the changes came barreling down the strait to my home island. The extensive Garry Oak woodlands above Burgoyne Bay on Salt Spring were under threat of logging and development. Like many other people featured in this book, I rose to the call of the land and its creatures, determined that it would be saved. With hundreds of other advocates of nature, we worked with the local land trust, often called conservancy, that enabled people to legally protect these unique and threatened places in perpetuity. This book chronicles the story of how we succeeded in protecting most of the threatened areas on Salt Spring Island, working with our local land trust, a water preservation society, a larger BC land trust, and with BC Parks. This book captures many other similar stories of locals banding together to protect threatened natural areas in their communities. Most of the islands in the Salish Sea are within a very small ecological niche, the critically imperiled coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimactic zone, the smallest and most at-risk ecological community in all of Canada. This bioregion is unique within Canada and home to the highest number of ecosystems and species at risk in the province, many of which are ranked as critically imperiled at a national and global scale. Sadly, less than 1% of the original forest in the coastal Douglas fir zone is left, with less than 10% of the young forest protected. In early 2021, the loss of one of my mentors, John Scull, a founder of the Cowichan Community Land Trust and the Land Trust Alliance of BC, woke me to the reality that these elders' voices would soon be silenced. I decided to visit other founders and capture their stories, their motivations and inspirations that led them to create these land trusts before they were lost. So began my exploration and sailing journey to the more populated islands in the Salish Sea to meet with the founders, to learn about their successes and challenges. I also talked with many who now carry the torch forward, younger people who are working with these conservation organizations. I began a 3-year sailing voyage to many of the islands in the Salish Sea to interview these unsung heroes behind these conservation land trusts. As I recorded the voices of many of the initiators and people now working with these organizations, I learned about new places that had to be conserved, educational, science, and restoration projects, and new Indigenous partnerships, along with the growing threats to the biodiversity on the islands. With human population and wealth growing exponentially on the West Coast, the impacts and changes in the Salish Sea and on the islands are significant, from loss of herring and salmon to homelessness for those people at the bottom end of the capitalistic spectrum. Yet, more and more people and organizations are resisting the singular economic driver that has led us here. Promoting individual stewardship of land and working with conservation land trusts, stepping up to protect nature, is a hopeful way forward for the future. May fair winds be with us as I take you in my small sailboat across the Salish Sea to the islands to meet their passionate defenders. Okay, I think I will go on to Salt Spring, which I was going to move aside, but it's got such a great story. I thought I'll share it with you. So Bavaria's 11th prince, Johann van Thurn and Taxis, owned 5,000 acres of Salt Spring Island from 1962 to 1999. He was from a wealthy aristocratic family who made their money in early postal services. He invested heavily in BC after the Second World War and formed the Texada Logging Company, which owned the largest area of private managed forest land on Salt Spring Island. Having lived on the Texada Logging Company property in one of its 5 houses in the mid-90s, I viewed the company as a friendly owner with house rentals that they rented out to islanders surrounding Burgoyne Bay. Some logging was done during this tenure, with plans to cut a third of its timber every 20 years. There was a small dock and a boom boat moving logs below the house I rented at the end of the road, which also led to a small public dock. With the prince's passing in 1990, the heirs found that they couldn't sustain the debts that had been incurred. The land was then purchased in 1999 by 2 Vancouver developers, Rob McDonald and Derek Trethaway, naming their company the Texada Land Corporation. Their interests were large-scale logging and real estate development, including fancy estates on the slopes of Mount Maxwell. The community moved into action, holding a welcome protest breakfast for the newcomers to discuss their plans as the logging company started to log. This all ran counter to the last 3 years of community planning to purchase the lands from the previous owner. Although the island's trust was regulating land use, they still had no jurisdiction over lands in the Forest Land Reserve, which some of these forests were in. And the logging had begun in earnest, with 3 to 5 acres being cut a day. Having the future protection of the lands around the bay so close to my heart, I was directly involved in the campaign from the beginning. I called Bryony Penn, a personal friend, then on the board of TLC, the Land Conservancy of BC. She and I agreed that the campaign needed someone local to head it up. We called Elizabeth White, a recent arrival on the island who had some experience with green business. She agreed to take on the job as fundraising lead, as long as she wasn't paid. Elizabeth got going quickly, chairing our weekly meetings and preparing an appeal portfolio, which outlined the campaign, the amount needed to raise, the ecosystems and habitats at risk, maps of the area, and an appeal that in the end inspired donors from all over the world. But raising the money to buy the land was not the only focus. Many people chose protest and community activism to bring attention to this destruction happening on the island and the ineffectiveness of the island's trust to stop it, without being given the legal authority by the province to effect their mandate. After the company clear-cut areas near the Buddhist monastery on Mount Tuam, some folks pounded crosses in along the road for every loaded logging truck that went by. Some stood in front of the trucks, and wheelchair user Sally Sunshine chained herself to a loaded logging truck. Others gathered around campfires, sang songs, and united together to try and stop the logging. I recall one fellow I knew who was arrested, eventually jailed for months in defense of the forests. He even lost custody of his own children for a time. Another woman in Ganges chained herself right under a logging truck once it was stopped by other protesters. The island seemed on fire during this time, the fire of anger, despair, revenge, and community kinship. Some staunch private landowners objected to the protests being outside the law, while the company's strategic lawsuits against public participation, or SLAP lawsuits, drew hundreds to Victoria to defend the actions of the protesters. These same SLAP suits were used on Galliano and Denman Islands by logging companies intent on using personal threats to thwart the protests. The company tried to counter the bad press, calling several community meetings, agreeing to negotiate for certain areas, building fish ladders along a creek they had trashed, printing full-page descriptions of their plans, while the mortgages they had taken out to buy the lands were being paid with the sale of the trees being cut. Another event that brought international attention was the creation of the Salt Spring 2001 nude calendar. It raised $100,000. A professional photographer, Howard Fry, created a 12-month calendar designed with scenes of naked local women in nature, meeting for tea, hiding behind trees, and doing the many things that this community actually did to raise attention, donors, media, and the money to contribute to its protection. Other events raised more money. A rock concert at the Commodore Ballroom in Vancouver was held, with local Randy Bachman headlining the event. Having watched art auctions raise quite a bit of money before, I and a few others organized the Where Art Meets Nature art auction, which expanded into a fortnight of evening presentations with local and guest speakers, including Robert Bateman, Bristol Foster, David Suzuki, and others. The Capital Regional District was heading the negotiations for the rest of the land at this time, which they eventually withdrew from because they said the company was asking 3 to 5 times the appraised values for the land. As the company was ever increasing their sale price during negotiations, in chilly January of 2001, a group of us went to Vancouver to protest outside the offices of the developers. The media portrayed Bryony as Lady Godiva, who, with other women, myself included, marched in front of the developers' offices on a horse, topless. The company, chagrined, came back to the negotiating table. Okay, and I'm going to do a little bit of a reading about Saturna, which I'm going to actually in June. Going to do a little kayak trip around Saturna. I'm looking forward to that. It's an amazing island. This is Boiling Reef in this picture right here, which is off the very east end of Saturna. From a knoll on Saturna Island's east point, I reveled in the raucous sounds of golden-colored stellar and darker California sea lions. I watched, fascinated, as these giant marine mammals lugged themselves up onto Boiling Reef. The island's rich marine life is a result of the nutrient-rich, turbulent waters created by the tides, the swift currents, and the Fraser River. These waters attract marine mammals, southern resident orcas, transient orcas, humpback whales, minke whales, seals, porpoises, dolphins in staggering numbers. The bald eagles, cormorants, oyster catchers, river otters, and ravens were all within sight of each other, some claiming the same rock and the same fish. I felt right in the midst of the phenomenal Salish Sea. This spectacular scene was marred by the fog, or was it smoke? The big smoke, the city of Vancouver in the distance. Although Saturna Island feels remote, it is within a major transportation corridor, surrounded by a population of 8 million people. Saturna Island, with its southern shores facing Boundary Pass, is the furthest south and east island on the Canadian side of the Salish Sea. As the Saturna Island Marine Research and Education Society, SIMRES, has aptly phrased, this is an ideal place to study the convergence of wildlife and humanity. Also known as Texan, a name which the Senchothan language means long nose, refers to the peninsula at its very eastern point. In many ways, Saturna is unique because it is in the geographic center of the Salish Sea, reaching from Reed Island in the north to Lummi Island and Bellingham in Washington state. Conservation efforts on the islands focus both on the rich marine environment that surrounds it and its at-risk terrestrial environment. I met with 4 of Saturna's outstanding volunteer conservationists. Maureen Welton is a graphic artist. Martin Whale is a retired doctor by trade. Susie Washington Smith is a scientist who worked both with the Islands Trust and the Nature Conservancy of Canada. They're all working with Simries. I also met with Priscilla Eubank, another longtime conservationist on Saturna, who has an in-house ecological high school program on her land, and she owns the general store. Priscilla Eubank arrived on the island in 1970. She explained during our interview in her wonderful hand-hewn home that she came young and fresh out of university with a landed immigrant card. She said, I knew I was home when I stepped off the main Queen and walked up the road past the Saturna Community Hall and into my new island life. Initially, she was attracted to the island's stunning physical beauty and enthralling biodiversity. Over time, however, she became just as drawn to the island's vibrant social and activist community. The Heritage Community Hall and the annual Saturna Lamb Barbecue have been mainstays in her life. This tiny community, off the beaten track, grew skilled in charting its own path. When faced with a school closure due to low enrollment in 2008, the community responded by establishing the Saturna Ecological Education Center. It serves grade 9 to grade 12 students. The goal was a resident-based, outdoor, ecologically focused education program. The school project coincided with another innovative community initiative. In 2009, another collective environmental education and heritage project involved salvaging and restoring a heritage lighthouse, the Fog Alarm Building, the FAB, at East Point, Tucktuxin. Assisted by federal agencies and scientific researchers, the community converted the old lighthouse into an information center, showcasing local marine biodiversity and island history. Run by the Heritage Committee of the Saturna Community Club, they acquired grants and student help. Then they started to design their first installation about the history of humans and orcas. This featured the evolving scientific understanding and relationships between whales and people. This led to one of the most seminal events on Saturna Island, the 2013 Whale Symposium. The conference brought together leading scientists and long-standing whale researchers from the 1950s on to discuss the trends and potential impacts on the southern resident killer whales and other whales in the Strait of Georgia. Richard, who coordinated the project with another 80 volunteers, told me during our interview that the months he spent restoring the Fog Alarm Building at East Point made him realize it was an astounding sight. Being at the central apex of the Salish Sea, you saw lots of natural wonders, the orcas, eagles, owls, and sea lions, yet you could lift your eyes and see Cherry Point, the refinery, and ships going by. What it revealed to me was this is a fascinating place for science, being right on the edge of the boundary. Maureen and Martin recounted that in 2014, Richard Blagborn, one of our island residents, initiated a whale conference on Saturna. It was the 50th anniversary of Moby Doll, captured at East Point off of Saturna Island for the Vancouver Aquarium. This was the first orca captured on the West Coast. The aquarium wanted to build a whale sculpture, but they didn't know the dimensions. They commissioned an artist harpoonist to capture an orca so they could make this sculpture. Maureen added, they had no success until the day they were leaving, when the J-pod came by. They harpooned a youngster, but it didn't die. They towed the young whale to Vancouver, and it swam along with its mother following. Then it was kept in an enclosure at Jericho Beach. Thousands came to see this killer whale that up until that time, 50 years ago, was considered a Moby Dick sort of monster, a human-killing creature. Not long after, it died, possibly from a skin disease or from damage made by the harpoon and additional gunshots used to try to kill it. However, this captured whale changed how humans relate to whales. With the interactions between Moby Doll and his visitors, and it was determined after naming that the whale was male, including the very man who captured him, people saw that the whale's behaviors showed a deep bonding between their kin. They learned what these orcas ate, and they were highly intelligent. Thus began the scientific study of the 3 subspecies we know today: transients, offshore, and residents. When all the whale researchers in the field came to Saturna for this 2014 conference, it became the impetus for people to realize their island is a very unusual place. This is where it all started, Susie said. We realized there's something unique about this area and that we are in the middle of the Salish Sea. Bill Austin, who started the Shaw Marine Center in Sydney, identified that we have some of the richest biota in and around the Salish Sea. During our interview, Martin described some of the successful SIMRI's projects. In collaboration with Professor Ruth Joy of Simon Fraser University, two of her master's students have come annually to Saturna to undertake fieldwork on whales and vessels in and around the waters of East Point. Martin also mentioned other SIMRI's projects, including eelgrass studies, sea star counts, collaboration with Parks Canada regarding the marine environment, and broom eradication on parklands. SIMRI's installed hydrophones to provide a live underwater soundscape in Boundary Pass. Martin added that, thanks to donations from individual donors, they now have hydrophones recording cetaceans 24/7 in Boundary Pass. You could be lucky enough to hear different cetaceans from the recordings made by these hydrophones located at the pass from SIMRI's website, live. Okay, I'm not going to do bone unless we have enough time. How is our time? Let's just stop sharing for a minute. 8:11. Is there any questions while I'm stopped for a minute? I guess not. Esmeralda?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and read us some
Bowen?
Bowen while everybody comes up with some questions for, is that the last one that you have, Sheila?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so after that, we'll have some questions if you want to start thinking about those.
Okay, I will go back. Whoops, I gotta go back to sharing the screen. Too many windows open. Here we go. Share, and there we go. Okay, I'm gonna go back one. There we go. Okay, Bowen Island. I completed the last leg of my conservation sailing journey in July 2023. Sailing downwind through a lumpy northwester, it took 6 long hours to reach my destination, Bowen Island, on the outer shores of Howe Sound. Squamish Nation elders unveiled a new sign at Snug Cove, welcoming visitors to Nuklalakum, Bowen Island, in 2021. It was a fitting gesture, given that the island is an integral part of Squamish territory. When I arrived at Snug Cove and its neighboring Mannion Bay, I was struck by the extent of development, with numerous close-knit houses and many private docks. At Snug Cove, hourly ferries arrive full of day trippers, residents, summer residents, and contractors. Just up from the terminal is a hub of commercial stores and restaurants I hadn't seen on any other island beyond Salt Spring. A bald eagle called my attention to the forested south shore of Snug Cove. Low-flying herons and seals draped on the rising rocks of Mannion or Deep Bay's southwest shore, revealing a continuous rock embankment that leads to a public causeway installed a century ago, behind which is the lagoon and the island's terminal creek. Though Bowen Island has been a recreational destination for Vancouverites through the 20th century, initially the Terminal Steamship Company provided access, followed by the Union Steamship Company, who promoted Bowen as a recreational destination. The Union Steamship Company built some 180 cottages, along with picnic grounds and a dance pavilion, to bring people to the island for picnics, camping, holidays, and moonlight cruises. After World War II, the economy began to change, especially after ferries started bringing folks to the island in cars. By the 1950s, the resort era ended. There were a few heritage buildings and some of the original fruit trees from 1887 still standing. Today, the new Union Steamship Company Marina welcomes visiting travelers and boaters to the historic lawns and docks located on a dredged and filled tidal flat. After the Second World War and the arrival of the Black Ball ferries, later acquired by BC Ferries, the Union Steamship Company started to sell some of their cottages, including one along the waterfront, sold to the grandparents of a pioneer conservationist, John Rich. For more than 50 years, John Rich's family has lived in the same house near Snug Cove. He's seen a lot of change. Early in our conversations, he remarked, If it wasn't for the threats to the natural environment and enjoyment of it as a natural place, I'd probably be a retired carpenter. Instead, John lived a far from quiet life, as he went on to be the chair of the Islands Trust for 6 years. After that, he became a lawyer and worked with several First Nations on litigation of historical claims and Aboriginal rights. Today, John is on the board of the Bowen Island Conservancy. John moved with his wife to live full-time on Bowen in 1973. He's told me Kim and I were just putting roots under us when we found that a developer wanted to put thousands of houses on the neighboring property and urbanize the place. Stan James, a developer with a deplorable track record, purchased 1,500 acres of the former steamship lands, stretching from north of the largest lake on the island, Killarney Lake, down to the former resort lands near Snug Cove. John Rich explained that James bought the land by securing private mortgages at 25% interest rates, counting on a quick sale of some 3,000 housing units, golf courses, etc., which would generate the funds for payments along with a very substantial profit. A pro-development director of the Greater Vancouver Regional District implemented a zoning bylaw that would allow 10,000 quarter-acre lots and a lodge on Bowen Island. Shortly after, in 1969, the provincial government's 10-acre freeze on the islands resulted in the GVRD and the province putting a hold on the bylaw. John had much to say about the antics that the developer used as the people holding the mortgages started to get concerned. James owned the community's water system as part of what he purchased, and he was threatening to cut off the water. He also threatened to cut off access to his property, which had been used for recreation for over a century by Bowen residents. The first thing he did was actively close a causeway, which goes between the lagoon and Deep Bay. In order to get from Deep Bay to Snug Cove, you have to walk on the causeway. Lots of people lived on the other side, and the community had been using it for over 50 to 60 years. So he built a chain link fence. People hauled it down. That's when I became active in 1975 in Bowen affairs. We were particularly affected by the causeway closure, and I had a problem with his attitude and proposal. We formed a committee for causeway access to fight back. This got me more involved in the local political scene. I got involved in the local advisory planning committee, and from there I ran in 1976 for the newly minted Islands Trust with another trustee supportive of putting an official community plan in place that would include recreational and conservation values. With the developer under duress from the mortgage holders and the new official community plan, which called for rural rather than urban development, James decided to start logging from Snug Cove over to Killarney Lake, the largest lake on Bowen. The community had always seen this area as environmentally and recreationally significant. With virtually no control over actions on private land, John convinced the 3 general trustees appointed by the province to sit on the trust committee of each island to request a stop and desist order to stop the logging from the province under the BC Environment and Land Use Act. The act was a lucky route for Bowen. As John said, it was only used 3 times across the province and then it was rescinded. John described the intense days during the community's protest against James. In the winter of 1977, James was trying to get a logging operation in. He got a cat too large to go on the ferry, so it was delivered to Sandy Beach, Deep Bay. A smaller logging show came on the ferry with a skidder and a small cat and about 4 guys. They went to a place where the contractor had things stored. Everyone knew logging was imminent, the beginning of the next week, so we had 3 to 4 days. Along with others in the community, we decided to have a demonstration and try to interfere with the logging and hope the province would agree with our resolution for the stop work order. Stanley Burke, a member of a Vancouver family who with a couple of other families owned a 600-acre piece of land on the southwest corner, was sympathetic to the struggle. He owned various small newspapers and had worked for the SKABC. He asked John, "What did you plan to do?" "Well, show up and stand in front of the bulldozers," we said. John described the resulting dramatic event. Burke said, "Make it presentable for TV. Use fire extinguishers and stop the engine." He sent us a bunch of fire extinguishers. He sent us a bunch of media too, and at 7 a.m., 50 people were standing out where the logging was going to start. Up the street came the Sun, the province, 3 TV and 1 radio station. They were pissed off to come for householders and hippies, but we were delighted. The loggers showed up and a bulldozer driver, and we stood in the way of things. This small outfit started their machines and drove forward, but the driver told his guys to stand down and get out of the way. But the bulldozer driver was storming. Stan James' manager showed up, who was a great big guy, very hostile. He was drunk and drunk with coffee and something could smell in it. We tried to make a deal with him to stop until we met to negotiate plans for the land. He agreed to do that, and we wrote it out and both signed. We were pretty naive. Then he realized what he had done and he tried to snatch it back. The TV gets the action. The agreement was to stand down, but the bulldozer driver doesn't agree. He doesn't have the keys, though. Someone's taken them. Assuming things had settled, someone throws the keys back to him because of the agreement. But he starts his bulldozer and drives into the crowd with people on his blade, a potter and a 13-year-old gal. He drives, trying to shake them off. The whole crowd is running along side by side. TV cameras are getting it. He stops at the precipice. The potter's wife climbs over the track, grabbed the driver, who punched her, following which the potter climbed over the machine from the blade and slugged the driver. This is all on national television news that night. And just as this was happening, a radio operator came in and said, "The stop work order has just come in." Today, Crippen Regional Park is 240 hectares, including Killarney Lake, all along Terminal Creek, leading down to the lagoon behind Mannion or Deep Bay. The park also includes extensive trails leading from north of the lake down to the older causeway, contains Terminal Creek Hatchery, Fish Ladder, and Bridal Veil Falls, out to Snug Cove and beyond to its end at Dorman Point. The acquisition of Crippen Park is a perfect example of how local people with patience and persistence can conserve land in their own communities. After 20 years of trying to protect Cape Roger Curtis, Owen Plowman, the current president of the Bowen Island Conservancy, found very generous donors who offered to help them acquire 3 of the lots. The land was much loved by residents and used as a park, and it was hard for people when it was taken over and divided up into chunks. But we got this donation and were able to acquire 32 acres of it. That's an amazing feat for a volunteer organization and a great boon to the island. It can be enjoyed by visitors and residents, and it made a huge splash. Well, today, the Bowen Island Conservancy has taken a big leap, and they purchased much of the Cape Roger Curtis lands in the fall of 2024. They purchased another 160 acres from Metro Vancouver after islanders objected to the campgrounds planned for the area. As Bob Turner from Bowen Island says, community is the way forward, connecting people to their home place so they know it better, and through that knowledge comes care and stewardship. Oh, there's a couple of pictures of the newest acquisition that the Bowen Island Conservancy has done, which is just amazing to me. And just a couple more pictures here of also went to Gambier Island and learned about the amazing protection of these sea glass sponge areas along the bottom of Gambier Island. This is just a little positive comment from Sarah Cox, who's an outstanding journalist. And as far as where you can get the book, that is a link to the indie bookstores, which stands for independent bookstores, where you can find out where it is in Vancouver. I took a look there and found it's pretty much everywhere in Vancouver. And just for this final little thing, just recently, I worked with the man who's responsible for the naming of the Salish Sea, Bert Weber. We worked together to put this book, which is long out of print. It was out in the early 2000s, and it's maps of all the islands, artistic community maps of all the islands. We made it into a website because the book was out of print. And so that little link down there, that bit.ly link, would allow you to look at all those maps.